Well, a very, very good morning, a very good evening, a very good afternoon to you all. A very, very warm welcome to the Stellenbosch Business Institute LeaderSHIFT, which is a series of 45 high energy, high impact conversations that we have with global leaders across the globe to try to establish how is it that we can navigate one world of uncertainty, look to the future, entertain and educate ourselves about how to implement foresight and do so in the company of those that are like-minded. My name is Faith Mangope, and as always, it is an honor and a privilege to take you through this afternoon, this good morning, this evening's procedure. And of course, it's going to be an exciting one as we're going to be dabbling a little bit into 4IR. We're going to be looking at adjusting. We're going to be looking at aligning ourselves. And more importantly, we're going to be looking at foresight. How do we implement foresight in a tangible manner so that indeed we can be effective leaders, not only to those who are serving, but of course to our bigger scope as well. So it is my absolute honor and my privilege this morning and afternoon to bring you the next guest for this series. We've got Craig Wing joining us this morning. I tell you one thing, every time I read out Craig's profile, I get absolutely dumbfounded. Craig Wing is a futurist, a global keynote speaker, PhD candidate. I'm telling you, somebody who has given about 500 keynotes to 5,000 leaders and executives across 45 countries. So when I say that this person knows exactly what they're talking about, I'm talking here about Craig Wing. Craig, it's an absolute honor to have you this morning and evening on LeaderSHIFT. Welcome to you, and I look forward to the conversation we're going to have together.
Afternoon, Faith. Yeah, thank you so much. And likewise, good morning, good afternoon to everyone dialing in. Thank you so much for having me, and Stellenbosch Business Institute. Thank you for allowing me to share some thoughts around this leadership series. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
We definitely are looking forward to conversing with you as well. In fact, let's kick it off. 45 countries or more than that you've just traveled, including navigating the Amazon. And I'm going to read this. You navigated the Amazon, you tracked gorillas in Uganda, tigers in India, swam with the whales in Mozambique. I wish you would have packed me in your bag. Skydiving in California, hiked in Machu Picchu in South America, and the Great Wall of China. How do you do it all, and what has been your greatest challenge thus far?
Well, Faith, first of all, I apologize if I have a bit of a cough. I literally just got back a couple of days ago. I was actually in India. I was lecturing at the Indian School of Business, where the temperature was like 35, 36 degrees. And then I flew all the way across. I was in France, in Evian, where I was lecturing there. Evian, where, you know, the bottom of the water. And then from there, I had a bit of a trip in Switzerland. I managed to go to the top of the Matterhorn, where there's an ice palace, and there's those wonderful sculptures. And then the Stanzerhorn looking over Luzerne. So I apologize if I have a bit of a cough. But yeah, look, I've been privileged. I've been lucky to travel to, I counted, it was 48 countries. I guess it's really one of those things, right? It's one of those things where I've been lucky, but more importantly, it's not just about luck, but it's creating the kind of future that I want, the kind of opportunities that come about. So it's really been a great experience. The one thing, though, that you mentioned is the Amazon, and perhaps that's one of the stories that I'd love to share with you. And so the story really is around when I went to Machu Picchu. You stop over in Cusco, and there's the potential for a side trip. And the side trip is, let's go through the Amazon. I thought, well, this sounds absolutely fantastic. Let's do that. So I went with a group. There was probably about 9 or 10 of us, and we're trekking through the Amazon, and it's hot and it's sweaty, and you can hear the parrots, and you see the animals, and you see all the different kinds of things. And we get to the water, and the tour guide looks at everyone and he goes, "Who's going to swim in the Amazon?" And everyone's like, "No, there's not a chance. There's no way. Heck, I'm going to do this." And the guy looked straight at me and said, you're going to do it. And I thought to myself, I've traveled around enough to know how this game works. And I said, okay, fine. I tell you what, if you swim, I'll swim with you. And he said, fine, let's do it. So we stripped down to our costumes and what we had, and we went to the water, and we went to our little canoe, 2-man canoe, and we were playing around. Eventually the canoe topples over, and we're in the water, we're swimming around. And the tour guide says, can you touch the bottom? And I said, there's not a chance I'm going to even try that. He said, good, don't do that. Because at the bottom of the Amazon, right at the very bottom, that's where the caiman and the anaconda are. And I thought to myself, this is absolutely insanity. So it must have been maybe only 2 minutes, but it felt like an absolute eternity. Anyway, we get back into the boat, we row back to shore, and I promise you, the other 8 or 9 people that were there, part of the group, they were fishing for piranha. And that's what we ate for dinner that night. So, it's just one of those great stories, and people are so captivated by it. But it is, you create the future that you want ultimately.
I like it when you say you create the future that you want, because it actually goes into something that you actually do. and that is to become a futurist. But for those of us that are not necessarily attuned to even the term, what does a futurist actually do?
Yeah, Faith, I hate the term futurist because the connotation is someone who can tell you the future. And I certainly can't do that, right? I'm not the kind of person that can throw the chicken bones or read the dice or the teas, etc. If I could, I'd be a very, very wealthy individual. Rather, the role that I have, my job is really about saying, well, how do I help you think about what the future may hold? What are the possible permutations of the future? And therefore, how do you create strategies that allow you to succeed in said future? That's really the job of a futurist. It's not about prediction, but it's about saying, how do you create scenarios or robustness through using tools like Foresight to ensure that you're ready for the future?
I want to talk a little bit about the future because a lot of us feel as though the future is very uncertain, especially navigating the paths that we're at a local context for, let's say, for example, in South Africa, but also the global community. A lot of people feel as though this future of ours that we speak about is so uncertain that I do not even know what kind of leadership strategies to implement so that I am able to be relevant in the future that is actually fast-paced coming. And it is obviously going with the digital divide, which unfortunately is becoming very tangible between developing economies as well as developed economies, but also just the status quo of how the world is moving, the geopolitical considerations and the like. So how does a leader, a corporate leader, adjust and also implement these strategies that make them relevant to the future?
Yeah, Faith, let me answer that, but also let me give you a bit of a personal perspective. And I think that'll be useful also around the grounding of why the future's work is so important, right? So in terms of where I come from, my family comes from China. I'm a second degree or third degree immigrant, depending on how you count. And the story that was told to me of my great aunt was that my grandparents came to South Africa during the Second World War. And the exact story is that my grandfather was captured by the Japanese during the Second World War and they held him ransom. And they said, we can see that you've got a lot of good stuff. You've got a nice house, you've got fancy clothes, et cetera, and we demand a ransom from your family before we set you free. And my grandfather said, that's all for show. That's not exactly how it is. But, if you set me free, we can make a plan. We can do something about this. And they said, no, we're not going to do that at all. There's no chance. But, over the period of the next couple of weeks, next couple of months, my grandfather befriended the maidservant, the lady who was cleaning the house. And he said, so look, the truth of the matter is we really don't have money as a family. But if you set me free, if you can untie me, what I'll do is I'll go to a new city, a new place called Johannesburg in South Africa. And as we all know, or maybe you don't know, because you might be one of our international folks dialing in, but Johannesburg's built in a gold vein. And he said this new city called Johannesburg, which translates from Chinese literally means city of gold. He said, there's so much gold here, you can just walk down the street and you can pick up a lump of gold. And so while my family can't pay the kidnappers, what I'll do is I'll give you a piece of gold. No, she said, that's not going to happen at all. He eventually convinces her. The two of them take over 2 months. They get on a boat and, it ends up in Durban Harbor. They jump on shore and they swim to shore. And that's how my grandparents end up coming to South Africa. And it's very interesting because even that story alone encapsulates a version of the question that you're asking, which is how do you think about the future? And it's often said there's only two sureties in life, death and taxes. And maybe if you're in South Africa, it's load shedding as well. But the other one that's also for sure that's going to happen is the future is going to happen to us. The future is definitely going to happen with us. And the challenge is in this world that we're in today that's underpinned by VUCA or tuna, whatever you may want to call it, it is indeed changing very quickly. So much so, in fact, that there's a term called nostalgia, where there's a feeling that today is as good as it's going to get, right? So to answer your question, how do leaders think about this world? How do they plan for a world that's changed, where things are different and change is the only constant? They say, well, it's very similar to what my grandfather did, right? It's about saying, first of all, how do you think about the future? What is the kind of future that you want, whether it is, going to a new city or going to the Amazon? And once you understand that, how do you work backwards from there? Now, here's the challenge. The challenge is how most leaders do future stuff, whether it's strategy or planning, etc. It's essentially a version of extrapolation. What I mean by that is this. Let's assume you're a company and you make cell phones for argument's sake, right? So what most companies do, they say, well, how do we extrapolate the past into the future as a singular view of where we're going to go? So we'll say things like, the company as a whole has been growing by 10% revenue per annum, 5% CAGR. We'll carry on growing by that amount, right? We've sold this many units of cell phone. It'll be the same version of it. We'll cater for certain conditions, economic conditions. We'll change headcount. We'll grow in these offices, et cetera, et cetera. But essentially, it's an extrapolation of the past, and it's really just an Excel drag and drop exercise, if I'm absolutely honest. That's extrapolation, right? The counter to that, or another version of that, is using foresight, right? Which is what today's really all about. And it's about saying, well, how do you use certain tools to think about what is the future and what might the future look like when you consider multiple versions of the future? I'm going to try this word, which I can never get, multiplicity, that word, where there's a lot of different kind of futures, right? And through using foresight, it's the ability to say, well, let's use tools that we use within foresight, things like horizon scan, things like scenario planning, things like sci-fi imagining, and all those different things to say, well, how do we think about the future differently? What you're fundamentally doing there, and what leaders need to do, it's not about a singular future. It's not about thinking about today into the future and extrapolation, but it's more like saying, let's think about a cone, where the narrow point of the cone is today and the wide point of the cone is going into the future. How do you increase the view? How do you increase your view into the unknown knowns and the known unknowns, and therefore the unknown unknowns as well? The challenge is, though, is that most of the leaders, even if they get to that point, so it's not about a single view, it's about a multiple view. The problem is there's about saying, well, it's still about today into the future. The right way of doing it, in terms of planning for a future that's unknown, a future that's changing, is about saying, let's flip this cone around. Let's now say the wide part of the cone is where we are today, and the narrow point is at a point in the future. Let's say, I don't know, 2032, right? 2033, whatever the day may be. And we'll say, what does that one specific future look like? Let's work backwards from that future. So how do we create memories from the future, so to speak? And how do we envisage what that world is going to be? And when we work backwards over 10 years, when we get to today, we can start seeing what are the opportunities to create that kind of future. So it's really about saying it's not extrapolation, but it's about using foresight, but more specifically, it's thinking about the future from the future. And because you can do that, you start to say, well, how do we move beyond things like biases? How do we see beyond what we can't see today into the world that we can reimagine, right? What is the kind of world that we want to have, much like the stories that I shared with you before?
I actually want to label on what you've just said here, Craig, because you've just extrapolated so many nuggets there. What if that particular organization or even that leader is afraid of that future? That they're not ready for the different types of futures that are being put forward as a supposition, so as it were. It'll be very difficult for that particular leader to work backwards and be able to implement foresight adequately. How do we overcome our fears? Because there's one thing about the future, though uncertain, and in some instances, it can be scary.
Absolutely. I mean, being a very well-known TV presenter, personality, etc., part of that fear is not the fear itself. It's the emotions, excitement, it's the energy. How do you bottle that energy? How do you think about the world differently, right? So one is I would really advise the leaders of those organizations, it's not about fear. Fear is a normal kind of response. It's normal. When you think about the future, it can be very scary. I mean, this is the kind of world that we're in right now. Think about where we are, right? There's so many things going on. We thought COVID was the pinnacle of the change we're going to see, and it's gotten more VUCA. It's become more different, right? The Collins word of the year was perma-crisis, which is we're always having these crises that we just seem like we're lunging into. So it's really about saying, yes, the world is changing, it's becoming more uncertain, becoming more problematic. But how do you almost bottle that energy to think about the future differently? To meet that, though, and this is where I will be in agreement with this fictitious leader, right? A lot of leaders need to meet a criteria, which is ensuring that we're relevant today, right? And for that leader, it's about saying, how do we ensure that we make money or profitable or we exist today? Because if we don't exist today, we can't exist in the future. Part of my research is really about saying, well, how do we survive in what I've called the duality of leadership? It's the ability to succeed today and plan for the future. To come back to your original question, though, being scared, being nervous is a normal human response. That's okay. The challenge is, how do we bring in more voices? How do we bring in more diversity to see the kind of world we want? How do we capture them? How do we translate that energy into strategic action and then planning in micro steps? We don't have to create the future today, in the 10-year future today. What we need to do is meet both ends. It's about being profitable today, making sure we've got a worthwhile, profitable business that hopefully meets the ideals of society. And then once we've got that, then how do we move backwards? It's both the future and today, and let that fear, that nervousness, that scared emotion stuff drive you?
Speaking about the future, we can't speak about the future without mentioning digital or technology or 4IR or 5G for that matter, 6G, wherever it is that we're at right now. And a lot of times I feel like the technology moves faster than the ability of the human being to adapt. For example, the latest trend in the craze right now is ChatGPT. People wondering, how do I implement it effective so that it does not replace the human touch? And more than anything else, when do you use it? Now, of course, Craig, you had an opportunity to work at Google and, of course, many technology companies and the like. And so you've got quite of a knack of understanding exactly how digital and how tech actually fits into our humanistic approach to life. But sometimes the human side of it will say, this tech is moving way faster than my ability to adapt to it. How do you see us being able to utilize technology, utilize the innovations for our benefit, for the purpose of foresight, instead of feeling as though the technology, like, for example, ChatGPT, is actually drowning us?
Yeah, when you look back into history, there was a certain audience that were called the Luddites, and the Luddites were very against technology. They didn't want the printing loom to come through, right? And they thought, technology is going to destroy all of our businesses, and get rid of us and make us obsolete. And that's exactly the same kind of thing we have today. Again, it's whether it's AI, ChatGPT, but it could also be argued it's the same thing that happened with the internet, the same thing happened with the car, and so on and so forth. The fact of the matter is technology is always going to be, it always has been, whether it was the fire or the wheel, there always will be a version of technology. The question is, how do you adapt and how do you use it in the kind of role that you are, right? Part of what's interesting is around the ChatGPT and AI, and I'm getting a lot of requests around what does it mean for myself? How do I think about this using this tool? And the answer in many respects is the same with a lot of different technologies. The first point is technology is not going to go away. It's always going to be there. How do you augment yourself and how do you ensure that you're a better performing individual? Believe it or not, right? I mean, you think back maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there was no use. You couldn't use laptops or tablets in the classroom. Madness. Go back maybe another 20, maybe another 30 years, you couldn't use calculators in the classroom, right? And what progressive organizations, individuals are doing is saying, well, how do you use technology to make yourself better? It's often said, this whole thing with AI. AI isn't going to replace you, but the person using AI will, right? And so therein lies the challenge. So when we think about jobs and we think about roles of human beings moving into the future, what we need to understand is there's a certain spectrum, there's a certain kind of job that will be replaced, right? And that kind of job is one where it's really about saying it's not related to people, i.e. there's no social skills and no empathy or no social cohesion required. And the other one, it's about repeating. If your job lies in a quadrant of a 2x2 matrix, a quadrant of no social skills, and it's about rote, it's about repeat. Unfortunately, the fact of the matter is technology will do your job, right? Whether that is mechanization, whether it's RPA, whether it's automation, whether it's the internet, whether it's AI, and who knows what comes next. The fact of the matter is if your job doesn't require human interaction and repeating, your job will be replaced. What does it then mean though, Faith? That's really the question, right? So what does it mean when technology comes by? What it really means is you need to understand where to use technology. And for that, in a world that's changing because of this 4IR stuff that you mentioned, you articulated so well, what is it all about? Well, it's really about saying, how do you use technology to free you to actually be more human, not less human? How can you be more human in a context of technology? And then let technology, whether it's AI or other, do the stuff that it can do. So let it do the reporting, the analysis, the insights. And then as a human being, be more human, not less human. The key piece here, though, is as we think about things as it transitions, one thing that you'll hear all the time is we're moving towards a zero friction world or a zero marginal cost world. The challenge is human beings by nature are friction points. And what we see through COVID is we need the human experience. We want to be in touch with human beings. It's a social condition. So moving towards a zero friction world removes people from the equation, and we can see the problems around that. So the answer to this is saying, how do you use technology to free us, to unleash us to be more human, not less human, so we can connect more with others in that human perspective?
Yeah, but that requires a certain type of leader, Craig, and it requires a certain type of skill. And also a different and a fresh perspective to this new world. Let's talk a little bit about the type of leader that then would be required to be able to implement and take a look at technology, as well as perhaps the innovation that we are constantly confronted with in a positive light, and saying technology is not there to make us less human, but rather, as we're saying, technology is there to make us more human. What kind of leader do I need in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think therein lies the answer, right? The answer is the kind of leader we need now is a more human leader, a more human leader, the kind of person who examines more humanness. What I mean by that, well, it's really someone that understands that it's not about output all the time. If it really is, if we're driven by commercial outputs, if the leader in charge is driven by commercials only, it becomes a very easy cost equation. The cost equation is when the cost of CapEx becomes less than the cost of OpEx. So the cost of CapEx of technology, when it becomes less than the OpEx of the human being, and it's a pure capital intense view, it's a leader that's driven only by money, you will replace the human being. That's a no-brainer, right? The question is, the kind of human that's now coming in is one that has empathy, one that has humanness, one that has compassion, has creativity and imagination. And I think for those are the most important things. It's around a leader that has creativity and imagination. Why is that so important? Well, to reflect back on your previous question, those are the things that AI can't give us. Now, some of the listeners may say, well, Craig, that's not completely true. Look at AI and Midjourney, and you have a look at ChatGPT and all these other kinds of AI-driven tools that can create new stuff. Well, when you have a look at the fundamentals of AI, AI is trained upon certain kinds of models. One of them is a large language model, which is how ChatGPT does, right? And essentially what ChatGPT does, and it's a proxy for even the image ones and video, it's about saying, well, how have you been trained? How has the machine been trained to give you what's expected? i.e. the output is dependent on what you expect it to be. So in the pursuit of pure creativity and pure imagination for a leader, it's about creating the new. It's about something that's never done before. So it really is about the creativity and imagination, but more importantly, it's about the humanness. It's about the humanness that we need to have as leaders, which put people beyond profits at all costs specifically, right? And it's about saying, well, how do we create for everyone, not just for our shareholders? And hence the shift away from just, from shareholders to stakeholders to maybe, as was said by Patagonia, maybe the only stakeholder we have is Earth.
Yeah, Craig, as you're speaking about this, it certainly does say a lot about how perhaps it's not even just about foresight, but rather about fearless foresight, which I think that's what's going to be needed in the future for us to look at foresight in a fearless kind of manner. And this fearless foresight as well needs a very adaptable leader, that particular leader that you're speaking about. But what about organizations where the culture is so traditional and the wheels turn so slowly that they're listening to this and they're thinking, but Craig, don't fix it unless it's broke. Let's continue with this way. It's worked this way for 100 years. It will work like 400 years.
Oh dear. Okay, sorry, thank you, Marika, but I think I got the gist of the question. I mean, the first point is, and I think this was great. I mean, I read this recently. I heard about it recently, right? Fearlessness or bravery isn't the absence of fear. Fearlessness is acting because of fear. It's even though we have the fear, we act and we do something. And I think again, and I love the term that you came up with, fearless foresight. It's acting in this kind of manner, even though we have the fear behind it. So I think that's the one point. For organizations to say, well, Craig, but the fact of the matter is it's always been this way. It's always been the same way. We will never be disrupted. Well, the fact of the matter is we can have a look at many examples. We can have a look at all the way from Kodak, where, the digital camera was created in their own lab downstairs. It was created in their lab and they said, well, we won't need this digital camera kind of thing. It's a passing thing, right? It'll never happen. We look at places like Nokia and you have a look at how they were successful. This Finnish company that is now Finnish, as they say, right? And what did they do wrong? Well, fundamentally, they missed the future because they thought what we had will always be there. And they missed a few things because they said, even though we captured at our peak something like a third of the world's mobile phones, they missed certain things that were coming on the rise. They missed a BBM messenger, the shift away from phone calls towards messaging. They missed Apple's swipe technology. And now they weren't just acquired once, they acquired multiple times. And organizations say, well, this is the way it is, and this is the way it will always be. Again, it's about shifting away from a singular view. Yes, that may be one potential future, but what if it's not? What if it's not that outcome? So how do you use foresight and say, well, how do you think about a world through multiple potential outcomes? Yes, one outcome may be an extrapolation of the past, and maybe a continuation of 10, 20, 50, 100 years of what we've done. But more importantly, what if it's not? What is our fallback? What is our plan? How do we think about it differently? So to those companies, I would say, look, I'm not saying throw the baby out of the bathwater, as I say, right? It's about saying, how do you plan for a world where it may not be like that? And because if it isn't what you're expecting right now, then we're in a lot of trouble. And as I said, ask many of the incumbents who are top of the game that are no longer there.
Yeah. It's a very difficult conversation because it requires us to actually be brave enough to step into that future. And as I said, fearless foresight is probably going to be needed the most as we navigate this world of uncertainty and a world where we have to work backwards from the future and be able to have different kind of futures being presented for each. But, when you're looking at the foresight mechanism and you're looking at where organizational culture is moving and how it's moving, when you're looking at, let's say, 20, 30 years from now on, the traditional format where people come to work, people park in, people use technology, people are afraid of technology, is it still going to be the same? I mean, if I had to ask you to look into the futuristic kind of crystal ball, what are we seeing in the next 10, 20, 30 years? Because I think that's what people are most concerned about. What does my future, Craig, actually look like?
Faith, the fact of the matter is, if I could answer that question, as I said before, I'd be a very, very rich person, right? I can't predict the future. I just can't, but therein lies the challenge, because people want certainty, exactly the point that we said before, right? People want certainty. The world is changing so quickly. Craig, give me some surety. I can't give that surety, but what I can do is I can say, well, let's think about a world where these may be some of those outcomes, in a world where the future work is, maybe we are all back in the office. Maybe it's not. Maybe we're all remote. Maybe there is no work at all. Maybe the question is fundamentally flawed. Maybe you reach some kind of utopia where AI and technology is doing all the work for us, right? So it's not about me predicting. It's not about me saying, here it is. And let me give you an example of why that is very, very dangerous. Think about Facebook, that has now appropriately changed the name to Meta, right? Old Mark Zuckerberg went off and he used his shareholder rights, where he still controls the strategy and the organization, the direction of that company. And he said, we are going to bet on this metaverse thing. In fact, it's such a big bet that we're changing the name to Meta. So off he goes, lo and behold, and they start the research, etc. And after losing a third of market cap, because essentially what Zuckerberg and Facebook or Meta did is they went through a process and exercise of prediction. And they predicted that the metaverse would be gigantic. And this was, for those of us watching in a few years from now, this is what happened in 2022. So he predicted, and he said the metaverse is going to be gigantic. After losing a third of the market cap, and it might rebound, it might change, but after losing a third of his market cap in 2022, it was an absolute failure. Why? Because the outcome of Meta's huge bet, of their huge prediction the metaverse is going to be gigantic, was essentially avatars without legs. And that's ridiculous, because if you look at the technology that was underpinning that, it was exactly the same as games in the early 2000s, where it was Second Life or Sims, etc. Because again, the point was they had bet that the future was going to be around a singular future, an extrapolation of the trends and the things that I've seen. And they were saying, this is where the company is going. It didn't end up that way. And so it's not about prediction. It's about saying, how do we ensure that we have companies that can succeed in multiple futures and create the strategy robust for all those possible permutations as they come about?
Craig, it also requires a certain element of vulnerability and the humility to be able to consult everyone in the room. So I always say, is this the time now for leaders to start not only looking at the board, not only looking at the COO and the CEO, but look at the cleaner, look at the person that delivers the mail, look at the person that is in the garden, to try to understand and determine what kind of organization will be future-proof. But that's going to need a leader that is humble enough to ask the intern, what do you think and what kind of organization do you want to work at? And I wonder how many leaders actually embark in that kind of vulnerability and being able to exercise the ability to ask the entire human capital within the organization.
Yeah, it's a great point, Faith, and it's really difficult. I mean, I think the traditional model of leadership that many of us have, specifically in the corporate world driven by profits, is that one leader that knows it all, right? It's that person that gives us direction. They stand in the front of the battle lines and they say, run, charge, and go, and they do that. And that model is changing. And why is it changing? Because of a number of different reasons. One is decentralization of information and access in terms of where we're going. Because the world is changing very quickly, right? Old models are changing. Old models are no longer relevant. Think about monopolies, where you can say, well, we have a monopoly because we've tied up a certain kind of supply. We've got, context in China, you can't get that anymore. Or we've cornered the market because we only have access to this kind of technology, this hardware. The internet has disrupted that, right? So the shift has been tremendous away from the old style leader that knows everything and stands up front that says, I will tell you what to do. And that shift has been predicated by a book that I like. It's called New Power Values by authors called Heinemann and Tibbs. And in there, they speak about the shift away from old power towards new power. And a big part of that is vulnerability. A big part of it is leaders being able to say, I actually don't know. But that's okay, right? And it's hard for us also, us to report to these leaders to go, I'm going to be okay working for a leader that doesn't have all the answers. But what's important and what's incumbent is then to say, if I don't know, do we know together, right? So the wisdom of crowds is an interesting philosophy. It's an interesting theory where, all of us is smarter than one of us. And so bringing more diversity into the room, whether it is exactly as you say, whether it's the cleaner, whether it's the gardener, whether it's the intern, whether it's the outsourced to whoever it may be, the more plurality of views, the more diversity you have, the more likely we are going to succeed in the future. Why? Because the future is diverse and there's more options as we go through time. So it requires not only vulnerability, because vulnerability is one of those aspects that says, I'm vulnerable to listen, but it's also the ability to act and to be wrong. And it's about saying it's okay to be vulnerable and wrong and then change, which is so vital. It's so important. It's those skills that are so fundamentally key. And I mean, part of my research is actually looking at this. It's about saying, what are the attributes of organizations that are successful in the future? And they fall into three buckets: leadership, organization, and landscape. And a big part of that is the leadership's ability to have a growth mindset. The ability to say, as Satya Nadella of Microsoft says, how do we shift away from a know-it-all to a learn-it-all culture? And I just love that.
Yeah, and you're saying it so beautifully in terms of learning it all culture. It requires a leader that is able to adapt to the future that is given by the cleaner, the gardener, the person that washes the dishes in the workplace, from the COO and the like. But would you also say that whilst we are consulting all of these individuals to try to establish a future that is holistic and all-encompassing, a leader with great foresight, a leader with fearless foresight also needs to be decisive, because they can have a lot of consultation and not a lot of decisions that get made.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think there's a balance, right? On the spectrum of things, there's the dictatorial, authoritarian, the person that says, this is the way, my way or the highway. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got, we'll consult and we'll ask and we'll go, and no decisions are ever made, right? Part of that is finding the balance. Part of that is finding the balance and saying, I think it was Churchill who said it best. He said, we need wartime leaders and we need peacetime leaders. And the same narrative runs through in business and also the times we're in today, right? When things are going well and things are okay, and we're pretty much, I don't want to say homogeneous because that's the wrong word, but when there aren't too many disruptions, when things are kind of okay and kind of predictable, we can have peacetime leadership, which is when we can consult more and drive more by consensus. But in a world where there's a lot of change and we need action, we need to understand what we're doing, we need wartime leaders. Now, wartime leaders are not, of course, as even though the name, the analogy, or rather the connotation is a wartime leader is not about saying you have to go to war. But in war times, you need to make a decision. If you are at war, you don't have time to speak to everyone. You have to say, fine, we're going to do this, and this. So there's a spectrum. On that spectrum of things, saying, well, am I, and this is time right now, for my business or the country, or whoever it may be, does it require a peacetime leader or a wartime leader? And finding that balance between, being dictatorial and being open. Part of that, finding that balance, is finding from an academic point of view, what is the point of saturation? Because again, you can't ask everyone everything, right? So even following an academic principle, what's the point of saturation? That if you ask the right questions, the outcomes and clarity of views become ones that you've heard it before. Then you've mostly reached the point of saturation, and then you can move forward from there. But it really is about finding that balance. But I agree with you. In times like we are today, it is about defaulting more to action versus just talking and no action at all. So it's really fearless, right? Plus action.
Yeah, there's so much that we can talk about. I wish we could spend the entire day talking about this, because in a way, it's almost a counseling session for being future-proof. And more than anything, being able to implement that kind of foresight. And we're going to come back, we're going to wrap it up a little bit, especially when it comes to giving us tangible and practical advice that we can apply as leaders, global leaders who have to make these tough decisions every single day, who have to look for the future, look forward to the future, have that foresight for the future, even in navigating uncertainty. We're going to come back and have these kinds of closing remarks from you. In the meantime, you were listening to us talking a little bit about being future-proof and about how to implement foresight, and actually relevant foresight. But in that, I want you to actually take a look at this video that we've compiled for you, which perhaps gives you a clear articulation of what this future looks like. future, the way in which you are able to plan for that future, the plan for the future that you want. And Craig, you were articulating to this a little bit earlier on, saying, perhaps imagine the future that you want and then make the necessary diagnostics and also work backwards so that indeed the outcomes can, number one, be varied, but also the outcomes can be the outcomes that are holistic, good for your organization. As we wrap up this conversation, what advice, practical advice, I want us to get very practical about this, practical advice that you can give to leaders so today they can implement in their organizations so that that future that we're speaking about, that foresight that we're encouraging, can actually be something that can be realized?
Yeah, thanks, Faith. Yeah, as I was watching the video, I was thinking about that. There's so many things, but I think let's distill it down to three key things. I think the first is, and probably the most important, is why, right? So why is it that we are doing whatever we're doing today? And more importantly, why is it relevant in the future? How do we think about that? Now, that's very cerebral, right? So that's not really a practical aspect. The next one that is very practical. It's about saying, make time to think about the future. Make time to think about where the world is going, right? If I were to open up any calendar of any executive, it'd be packed with meetings. But how many of those meetings are literally 1 hour a week to say, this is my hour to think about the future and how do I do those kinds of things, right? The third one, and the last piece is, it's not about prediction, as I said several times. It's about thinking about the robustness in your organization. What are the many kinds of futures out there? And then how do you build flexibility into your organization? What that means then is about, towards your point, bringing in diversity of views. Today already, right? Start with having a conversation with someone different to you. It may be something like, having some kind of reverse mentoring. Find someone who's younger than you, someone who understands where the world is today. They shouldn't be a direct report to you, but ask them, how does the world work? Basically, get more views. Find out what is going on in the world today, find out about the different perspectives, understand what's going on, and create a narrative of that, because the world and the future does belong to all of us. So the more diversity and different kinds of views you can have, the more likely you are to succeed in the future. And it's all through understanding that foresight is one of the tools. But I think to your point, it's really about being a vulnerable leader that practices this fearless foresight, as you said.
Craig, it's been an absolute pleasure having you for this morning, this evening, this afternoon, depending where in the world you are joining us from. I know that we'll be able to take some of the nuggets that you've shared and perhaps be braver and being able to carve out that future that we need in our organizations, especially as global leaders. We look forward to engaging with you once more. And of course, more than anything else, I think it's just us being able to tap into some of the strengths and the skills that you were speaking about so that indeed we can imagine a future that is beneficial to all, but a future that is relevant to the needs of the people of the time. So much appreciated, Craig.
Thank you so much, Faith. Thank you for having me. And again, thank you so much to Stellenbosch Business Institute. And thank you for allowing me to be part of this LeaderSHIFT series. And hopefully we'll be engaged more. Thank you very much, Faith. Have a good one.
Absolutely. Have a fantastic one. Do not go anywhere, because you do know that our next LeaderSHIFT series takes place on the 31st of May at 4 p.m. What that means is that you get to have a roundtable conversation. You are truly invited to it, where we have high impact leaders, fast conversations, where we get to actually have and implement that foresight so that indeed we can be the leaders that the future needs. And I think that's a big key of this. How do we become the leaders that our future actually needs? And of course, our next series guest is indeed Adam Kingle. He'll be joining us for the conversation. I know that it's going to be quite a treat. However, from ourselves here at the Stellenbosch Business Institute for this series of LeaderSHIFT, it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to broadcast to you this morning and this afternoon and this evening. Until we do it again in May, have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye-bye.